Welcome to our speakers and to our audience, whenever you're watching this, to this recorded panel event, the third in our Time to Talk series, Time to Talk Mental Health, highlighting the specific mental health challenges of women and girls and exploring faith-led responses to mental well-being. I'm Maeve Carlin, Project Development and Communications Officer from the Women's Interfaith Network, a women's charity for all faiths and none, with grassroots groups across London and the South East. Mental health is a global issue that affects us all, but it's important to remember that this does not mean it affects us all equally or in the same way. Over the last decade, the rate of mental health problems among women has been increasing, with young women particularly affected. The Mental Health Foundation reports that 1 in 5 women have a common mental health problem versus 1 in 8 men, and recent studies have shown that young women between 16 to 24 are actually 3 times more likely to experience a mental health problem than their male peers. Statistics also show that women and girls tend to face different mental health challenges than men. For example, depression and anxiety in adult women, and eating disorders, self-harm and suicidal thoughts in children and adolescents. With limited research into what drives these gender differences, we don't know for sure why this is. What we do know is that gendered expectations of women bring their own challenges, whether it's inequality at work or a sense of overwhelm from the so-called double burden of professional and caregiving responsibilities. Gender-based violence has a particularly devastating impact on mental health and well-being, with a significant percentage of survivors attempting suicide or suffering with self-harm. We also know that navigating the world as a woman means navigating sexist abuse and microaggressions, as well as a pervasive threat of violence, all of which has an impact on women's well-being. Young Women's Trust research conducted with Dr. Ruth Hackett from UCL found a clear link between the experience of sexism and mental ill health, with those reporting sexism being 5 times more likely to suffer from depression. Of course, these experiences will be compounded for women with intersecting identities, like those living in poverty or experiencing racial trauma or abuse. Women from minoritized faith communities also face the additional burden of structural racism and other forms of prejudice, like Islamophobia or anti-Semitism. These stresses not only exacerbate mental health issues, but also women's ability to access treatment, especially in communities where there is stigma around discussing and disclosing mental health conditions. We need a better understanding of what is causing the increase in mental health issues among women and young women particularly, including gender-sensitive, faith and trauma-informed interventions. Today's conversation brings together women from the youth mental health sector with those providing faith-led mental health support to shine a light on these issues and learn how we can all champion mental health and well-being in our communities. I'll now introduce our 4 speakers. Priya Nagda-Swainson currently works as Community Development Officer at Papyrus, providing education and training in suicide prevention skills for the community in London and across the South East. Priya used to work in advertising and the media, but a personal tragedy led her to mental health work, where she inspires change, raises awareness, and builds confidence in those supporting young people who are thinking about suicide. Louisa Rose is CEO of Beyond and the founder of Now and Beyond, the UK's only national mental health and wellbeing festival for the educational community. Louisa worked as a social media consultant over the last decade and is particularly interested in reinforcing healthy social media habits for young people. Louisa is diagnosed with depression, anxiety, Tourette's and OCD, and publicly reflects on her personal mental health journey. Louisa is married and a mother of 2 young boys. Emma Dorman is Senior Education Coordinator at Jami, where she educates, inspires and raises awareness of mental health. She has been a mental health educator at Jami for over 7 years. Emma's role is outward-facing, providing interactive sessions on a variety of subjects to a diverse set of audiences. Her training portfolio includes a CPD accredited training and mental health first aid for both adult and youth. In her spare time, Emma continues to advocate for mental health via her own blog and is passionate about expanding her novelty rubber duck collection. Zainab Ahmed is a volunteer with the Lantern Initiative, which is a Muslim mental health charity. She also works for How Are You Peterborough as a digital and communication specialist, where she regularly engages with the Muslim community to understand what they need from mental health services. Project Zainab has been involved in includes facilitating weekly chai and chat sessions, assisting at connecting Muslim mum sessions, delivering workshops and organising and hosting events. In her spare time, she enjoys reading, writing and going for walks. So we'll now kick off by asking our speakers to speak for around 5 minutes about their work and their perspectives on this issue. Priya, could we start with you?
Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're well. It's really great to be here and introduced by Maeve. Thank you very much. Papyrus obviously works with children and young people. We don't have any sort of criteria with who we work with, but we have noticed, especially in our work with the educational sector, which we've been doing quite a lot, a huge increase over the last few years of young girls, teenage girls, young women, mothers, people working in faith groups, really suffering a huge upturn in suicidal ideation and suicidal behaviours. Now, so many factors, as you said, Maeve, so many pressures anyway to face navigating the world as a young girl, as a young woman. But I think the pandemic, we can't ignore the impact the pandemic has had on opportunities available for young people straight away. People lost the opportunity to go to university. Some of them might have been the first people in their families, in their generations, to go to university. People lost that opportunity. People lost the opportunity to take up placements, jobs. People lost the opportunity to go away to university or to live with friends. To go to clubs, social clubs. People lost the ability to go to therapy and to take up their face-to-face sessions that they were doing. Treatment was cut short for some people. People couldn't attend inpatient therapy. People couldn't attend inpatient settings. You mentioned there about eating disorders and disordered eating. A lot of this really intensive work couldn't take place. As you mentioned, their caring responsibilities, were compounded. Services were cut and people were having to double end their care, looking after children and elderly parents or sick relatives. So that's just to do with the pandemic. All the other intersectional issues that are always there permeating under the surface are still also added pressures. And then you've got on top of that social media. So I'm really pleased, obviously, that Louisa's here today. It'd be fascinating to speak to you as well about your thoughts here. But we are seeing such a scary rise in the consumption of self-harm and suicide images. I'm sure you've all been following the Molly Russell inquest with, incredibly awful tragedy. And I am amazed that the social media giants that have been at the inquest have actually held their hands up and admitted fault. I think that's a huge step forward. It's taken a tragedy, as unfortunately always seems to take the loss of a young person or a person in these situations, but let Molly Russell's death not be in vain and let us do something about it. But, just in a couple of minutes, I've reeled off that list of pressures and problems. Navigating the world as a young woman today in the UK, 2022, I don't think, I'm 40 now. I'm thinking 20 years ago, the world was a completely different place. Half of these things weren't pressures for us. And it's really important to us at Papyrus that we make these connections with faith groups and faith communities, because we know that faith is a protective factor for many, many people, and it can really, really help them through those dark and difficult times. We're making those inroads to speak to communities and faith groups and faith leaders and how we can work together to appropriately and respectfully provide support for women and girls who are part of faith communities but who are reaching out because they're thinking about suicide. So that's kind of where we are at the moment. It's not all doom and gloom, but we want to work together and want to move forwards, and we'd love to make those connections to work together.
Thank you so much, Priya. It's sort of terrifying to hear those combinations of what young people were facing during the pandemic, and the impact that may well have had. But it's exciting to hear about how we can work together, and that maybe there's changes in areas like social media. Louisa, could I hand over to you?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Priya. It's really great to hear from you as well. And thanks very much to Interfaith Network for having me today. I mean, it's as Priya said, it's not all doom and gloom. It's really not. We're learning a lot. Recently, we have learned a lot, but unfortunately, it has taken a great loss in order to do that. A loss of connection, a loss of, freedom, a loss to so many people. So I am the CEO of Beyond, and Beyond is a grant-giving organisation that supports young people's mental health and well-being. It was founded by Johnny Benjamin, who some of you might know, and we work very hard to put young voices at the centre of everything that we do. So as such, we have a group of young volunteers that co-produce all of our work with us, called the Beyond Youth Board. And they are actually a group of people that range in ethnic diversity, age, sexual, gender identity, geographic location, mental illnesses, etc. So they really do represent a huge variety of experiences across the UK. And what is very consistent with them is that women find it, I think, easier to open up than men do. But in doing that, we realise just how great the issues are for young women. So I wanted to just touch on something that Priya had mentioned. There is so much pressure out there for young women, but at a time when everything's shut down, there were a lot of people sort of I would say government level saying that services, people didn't lose access to services, but actually the research has found that 30% of young people that would have relied on certain services to get them through the pandemic lost access completely. So that is very, very real reason why we're seeing such an increase in, for example, the suicide rates. I mean, the suicide rates for young women, we know now, are higher and have increased faster than ever since records began. I mean, I find it shocking, but also fascinating that we can get to 2023 in as sophisticated a world as we live in and allow that to happen, so there's a lot that really needs to be done. In terms of what we're hearing from our young people, because I always want to kind of use their voices on platforms like this. So they're telling us that it's very difficult for them to be seen and heard. So when they try to access services, there's nobody that maybe sounds or looks like them, which is the first barrier. In terms of minority or marginalized groups, we know that it's a lot more, stigma is a lot rifer in those groups. And so actually, although we find a lot more with the males that it's difficult for them to break through that stigma, so many of our young women have really faced such difficulties in talking about their own experiences within their own communities. So that's something that we really need to look at. We also understand that, I mean, we've touched on it, but I'll go into a little bit more detail on it. That the impact that social media has on young women is just huge. The level of unrealistic body ideals and unrealistic life ideals, actually, what it means to be a good person seems to be defined by how well your posts perform on social media platforms. There is such a false self-worth that's gained from the level of engagement that your content is shown. Now that's something that obviously was amplified hugely during the I would say a spotlight on it was placed on it during the inquest into Molly Russell's death. And I think that the spotlight that we are seeing is obviously a move forward, but what really needs to happen is a change in actually the way that we approach social media in education and the education system, because we're at a time right now where we are introducing tech to young people, young girls, as an educational tool in schools. So it's at that point that I truly believe, as somebody who's worked in this space for the last 10 years, we really need to be educating our young people at that age, when we hand them those tech devices for an educational tool, their capabilities, or at least to start talking about the words and the language that they will become a lot more familiar with as they get older. Because what we're seeing is a group of young people that are absolutely 100% addicted to that tech, and they are addicted to that tech because that tech has been designed in such a way that the tech designers have used psychology, have used the brain, the way that the brain produces chemicals when interacting with certain activities and engaging in certain behaviors. That is being used in the way that these devices and these platforms are designed, and that is addicting people. Now, we can stay in control of those addictions if we are taught how to, and that's the missing piece for me. So I really believe that it's about teaching young women the importance of pure self-worth, where you can get that from. You cannot get that from a social media platform. So it's about teaching them really where that comes from, and then at the same time in teaching them how to navigate these platforms in a healthy way. So we are because we're addicted, we need to do a lot of education around how that happened. But because we actually end up surfing social media mindlessly, which also you could translate as carelessly. And what that means is that young women fall very, very deeply into sort of dark corners of social media unwittingly. And because of the way that the algorithms are designed, the content that they have sort of engaged in subconsciously actually gets reinforced, and they get shown more and more and more of it. And so that belief that they need to be like that, the people in those content that they see, becomes greater and greater. And we have seen such an increase in self-harm, suicidal ideation, eating disorders. That's the tip of the iceberg, but it's a pretty spiky tip. It's the work that we do at Beyond. We raise money to be able to award schools with money to be able to bring in autonomously the emergency interim mental health support that they need in that moment. Our applications are full of self-harm, suicidal ideation and eating disorders, and one of the greatest culprits for that is blamed on social media. And obviously it's a whole, we have to look at it in a holistic way, but social media is definitely a huge part of that. So during the Molly Russell inquest, we actually did produce some work around how to surf social safely, and that's something that we're really keen to kind of help to really to get to young people, young women particularly. The pressures on young women are just huge, and we have young women on our youth board that talk to us about not being good enough because they're not the same as their friends, and we know that not being the same as somebody is actually what makes you unique. It's not a negative, but it's about really helping them and empowering them to do that. So and just as a sort of final note, I really do think it's important to mention that I'm actually a great proponent of social media. I think that it's a great tool. It brings communities together. It brings communities together across any interest that you might have. And what my sort of my leaving piece is always, if a piece of content doesn't inspire you, empower you, or motivate you, then unfollow it or mute it, because social media, when it does those three things, is great. So that's me.
Thank you so much, Louisa. I mean, that 30% stat you mentioned is really confronting. And I think in that situation, going to social media, looking for connection is such an understandable thing. And there are clear action points there for what we can do to make it a safer space for young people. So I'm now going to hand over to our colleagues from faith sector mental health work. Could I hand over to you first, Emma?
Thanks, Maeve, and thank you to the Women's Interfaith Network for hosting me and my colleagues on this panel today. So just a very brief introduction to Jami. Jami are the specialist provider of mental health services for the Jewish community. We were founded over 30 years ago by friends and family of those who were experiencing mental illness and distress, in an acknowledgement that a faith-based support service could be incredibly helpful. Since then, over the past 30 years, we have expanded hugely. So whilst we continue to provide one-to-one bespoke recovery support through community hubs to those who are experiencing their own mental illness and distress, we also have a family and carer service, which is just expanding exponentially. Since the pandemic, we've been supporting close to 1,500 people through our services. From COVID, we saw a 29% increase. Every single referral during COVID cited COVID as one of the reasons that they were seeking support through Jami. And our referrals and to carers and family support have been tripling. So we really are seeing this peak of people wanting mental health support from us within the Jewish community. We also do provide mental health on the high street through currently one Headroom Cafe, which is based in Golders Green, but there are plans for further ones. Headroom Cafe runs as a cafe, but anyone from the high street can walk in, have a conversation, get involved in the wellbeing activities and sessions that we run there on a daily basis. So we're really quite spread out in our offering. Where I sit is within our education service, and our education goes out into the Jewish community and wider to provide a variety of mental health awareness, mental health first aid, CPD accredited mental health training, really across the board. And part of that is our work with young people through schools and the youth movements as well. So quite a broad audience for us in many ways. So I think it's really interesting that people are always quite surprised when I mention that the organisation I work for is a faith-based mental health charity, and people are always quite curious about the need for that or why there is that. I think one of the things that we do, and we do incredibly well, is that we provide support alongside other mental health services and providers. So often we can think about mental health support. I like to think of it as a puzzle, and Jami are often one of the pieces of the puzzle. And like many of the voluntary sector mental health organisations, we do a lot of work holding people while they wait for further professional support to kick in. But why maybe a faith-based one? I think it's important to consider that there is a specific narrative for many people who lead a faith-based life. And obviously I can't speak for all faiths, and within each faith there is a huge amount of diversity within communities anyway. But there are often a shared language within various elements and communities within various faiths. There are key milestones of religious or cultural life. And I believe that when we have a faith-led approach within a service, whether that is a service for your community working with other providers as Jami does, or your mental health service is making an effort to understand faith-based life, it promotes this understanding and empathy, which really builds the connection, which is vital for any kind of support to happen. I also think there's, Louisa mentioned it earlier about people being worried about speaking, and that might be as a young person, as a young woman, and it might be within their faith community as well. So I think we have to really acknowledge the stigma and discrimination from inside and outside, whether it is a fear to speak within your faith community about your mental health or your experience of mental illness and distress. Some faith communities are phenomenal at this, some of them are more on the beginning of their journey, and again, such variety. But likewise, we know that there are fears from people accessing kind of national services who fear that they will receive stigma and discrimination, not because of their mental illness, but because of their faith identity as well. So again, there's a good reason to have faith-led charities, initiatives that really help us. And I do believe we're making strides in this area. Obviously, I sit in the education team. In the past few months, I've had contact for 2 different organisations, one NHS-based, one voluntary sector-based, asking us to kind of run training around Judaism and Jewish life to help their providers understand what their service users, their clients may be bringing to them, and extra concerns or things they should be aware of, which is just phenomenal to see them opening their doors and their ears, I suppose, in that way. So I do think there's been great strides, but I think for all of us talking about, you know, well-being and mental health in the faith-based communities are great, because they do become safe spaces for people. There's a huge amount that is great about faith communities for your mental health if we are talking about it. So thinking about all the great things about self-care, a lot of that can be found in a faith community if that's where you sit, if that's what you want for your life, whether it's, you know, them being places of connection spiritually as well as human connection as well. I know that, you know, conversations, a lot of requests we got for education in the pandemic was partly mental health education, and communities were rightly worried about their members' mental health during the pandemic, but also to bring people together. I think we all missed that in the pandemic, that kind of face-to-face human touch. So they're great in that way, but they also are often hubs of education and extracurricular activities and creativity and opportunities to volunteer and feel part of a community. Faith can be a big part of very many people's identities, or culture can be as well. And we know, I think going back to what we've just been speaking about, you know, social media and seeing what other people are doing and comparing and forming our own identity, particularly with young women growing up, being part of a community, whether that is a faith community or not, can be huge for a person's mental health. And if you belong to a community where you are seen holistically as someone with a faith, as someone who, you know, looks after their mental health or has an experience of mental illness and distress, and you are seen as a full holistic person, that's phenomenal for our mental health and our confidence. So I do think there's, you know, a lot that can be said for faith-led approaches and initiatives and support, and whether that is standalone charities and initiatives, or whether that is kind of putting mental health on the agenda in your community, in your organization, so that anyone who does have a faith identity coming through your doors feels seen and understood across the board.
Wow, thank you, Emma. That jigsaw puzzle image is so helpful. And I think what you were saying about a religious community as a place of self-care was a really lovely image. I hadn't thought of it in that way. So thank you for that. Zainab, can we hand over to you?
Thank you for having me, and thank you to the other speakers as well for a valuable insight. But I guess to echo what Emma was saying from Jami, that being a faith-centered space is, we want to be a safe space, and we want to make sure that we provide that sense of safety to people in the community. And the Lantern Initiative itself was set up by Safira, who couldn't be here today, when she was struggling with postnatal depression. And she set up a coffee meetup with other women who are experiencing mental health issues. And then it became a regular weekly thing. And then she realized, actually, I think this is what we need. And then held the first ladies only event in 2016. There were 70 spaces, and then every single space was booked. And she was like, yeah, this needs to happen, needs to be more women-led and women-centered events, especially at the Muslim community. And I think, I mean, I could talk for ages about why it's needed, but you can imagine with Islamophobia, the young women facing Islamophobia, and then being visibly Muslim is in itself an incredibly harsh reality to face, and that's something that you kind of are you instantly have to face, and that you're just born into this world that you know that from media, from politics, from the government. It's one obstacle that you instantly have to face. And we know that that's a struggle with young women especially, and we need to do more work there. But we know that that having this, having Land Initiative there as a Muslim presence is so important for the Muslim community to understand that we are here to listen, we are here for them, and we represent them. And that's something that we're striving to do every single day. And Muslim women are facing really big difficulties when they go and seek help. I mean, one of the obstacles is that there's hardly anyone that looks like them in the field. And if they do seek help, it might be from a non-Muslim, and they won't understand their struggles. And I have countless stories of friends and of myself where I've gone or I've heard from friends where they've gone and the therapist has an assumption already that they're either oppressed or they have absorbed like notions from where they've come from their culture, and then projected that, and then that's impacted how their therapy has gone, and then they don't seek help again. And then that's a big obstacle that we're facing, that mental health issues are underreported in the Muslim community because they don't feel that they can go to anybody because no one can understand, and their needs are not validated. And Islam is a total way of life that I think neglecting that in the mental health space just makes you instantly feel that you're not seen or heard. And we can't expect people to go and seek help when they feel that way. So we try and do a lot of work in that area. We have free counseling sessions. We do a lot of women-centered events, such as Chai and Chat, where where women come together every week and they get a free drink and they just get to chat and be with each other. And sisterhood itself is a very important concept in Islam. There's a lot of emphasis on relying on each other, and like what it's called is ummah, like the community. We have a really strong sense of, we need to have a strong sense of belonging, and we know that that itself is a great protective factor against sort of mental health issues and sort of keeping you well. So we really try and focus on these Islamic principles in our events, and we try and do workshops, and we've gone into a school where we've done some psychoeducation, but we know that we need to do more, especially as Louisa was saying about the pressures that young women are facing are insane. And they were tough on hours at school, and it's been a few years, but I can't imagine being at school now with those kind of pressures, and it's really, really difficult. And then there was social media, and it's all it's a lot, and we know that we need to do a lot more work there. But the work that we're doing at the moment, we feel that is really valuable in making other Muslims feel heard and seen, and that is super important when we know that the other, like the system or even the NHS, that we need to do better in making it more inclusive. And it's slow, but it's not quite there. It's not fast enough, I think. But I won't go on too much. That's basically the crux of our work, and we are hoping to do a lot more.
Thank you so much, Zainab. So many interesting things from what you said. I think this idea of being seen and heard and seeing yourself in the services that you seek for support is so important. And to the idea of how harmful it would be if you go to seek help and this person doesn't know how powerful sisterhood and ummah and community is in your life, and sees that as a negative thing. And here at the Women's Interfaith Network, we really believe that connection between women is such a radical and powerful thing. So thank you to our speakers for those fascinating insights on supporting women and girls' mental health and wellbeing from both secular and faith-based perspectives. We're now going to kick off the discussion part of our event. I've got a question for both Papyrus and Beyond. what are some of the key things you hear from young people you work with on this issue? What would be a sort of key takeaway that you think they would want us to share in this space?
I think that the one key for us is representation. It is so crucial, and it is so incredibly damaging when a young person says, I'm actually ready to ask for help, but nobody understands me. No one sees me, no one gets me. And I do think that there is a fundamental flaw in the way that we recruit and the way systemically we look at onboarding people to services, because now I always get muddled up, but there is the clinical psychology route, doctorate that you can do, and then there is the, counselling psychology degree that you can do, and one of them is paid for and one of them isn't. But which one do you think prioritizes people from marginalized groups? It's not helpful. It's not a sign to our young people that we're truly investing in them. And I really think in terms of fixing some of the systemic inequalities, we really need to be looking harder than this. So for me, what I know that our young people would feel very strongly about me saying that. That's one of the biggest issues. And the other one is this idea. Now, we're talking about connection a lot, but the irony about connection is that we also find that being constantly connected but to the wrong thing is detrimental to our mental health. So back to what my thoughts are on social media, and I do think that it's a positive place to be. It does feed into our general relationship with tech. And if we are so constantly connected that we can't ever unplug, that we can't ever listen to our minds and what our minds are telling us, then actually connection becomes negative. So it's a very interesting thing. It's actually a topic that I think we could probably all just sit and discuss for hours on its own. But I think that connection, we have to acknowledge the right kind of connection, and we have to reinforce the right kind of connection, and we have to be able to mitigate the impacts of the wrong kind of connection. So I think they would be the two things.
Thank you so much, Louisa. Priya, could I hand over to you?
Absolutely. So the main thing that we hear at Papyrus, we are a youth suicide prevention charity. We just support young people who are thinking about suicide. But the way that we support those young people is by educating and training the people around them. And that tends to be adults. It tends to be adults because they are the staff working in schools, in social clubs, in youth clubs, in the NHS, the GP surgery, in football clubs, in shops, in offices. It tends to be the adults who don't see what's going on beneath their own noses, who don't see the signs and indicators that young people, children are struggling, crying out for help silently. They don't see that, which is why so many young people turn to social media and those dark corners that Louise mentioned, because they feel that they are getting the help that they need. Falsely, they believe that they're getting the help that they need because those dark corners are usually created by other young people. So what we hear and see the most is, I don't know where to turn to for help. The adults around me don't see that I'm suffering and struggling. They don't have the capacity, the knowledge, the empathy, the time to give me the help and support that I need. So I'm turning to X, Y, Z. And instead of getting help, support, guidance, and advice, they're falling further into that deep, deep hole and accessing negative things. So that's the main sort of issue that we face, is how to appropriately reach out to young people. What do they need in terms of accessing campaigns, help and support? What will draw them towards those positive sources on the internet and social media? How can we engage them in a way that they don't think I'm being told what to do by someone that doesn't understand how I'm feeling? Whereas making sure that the adults are on board as well, and have that training and support So when a young person does say, okay, I need to reach out to somebody now, I feel that I'm in this struggling place and I want to reach out to somebody, have they got the appropriate adults around them? Have those adults around them who are supposed to be safeguarding them and looking after them, do they have the training and education and support and resources behind them that they can effectively have those conversations? So young people are crying out for help. They're not receiving that help from the adults around them. They're accessing those dark corners. And Papyrus is just one of many charities who are out there providing that education support for those adults. So kind of just explaining what we do and what we're hearing from young people all the time.
That's so clear, Priya. It seems that this idea of not being heard is coming up again and again. Emma and Zainab, I was just wondering, we've been talking about the pandemic so much. Do you think there are particular ways that the pandemic affected religious communities in specific ways from your own perspectives that perhaps in secular mental health spaces we might not quite understand those impacts?
I think that's a really interesting one, because I always think you don't know what you don't know, so I cannot speak for all faiths or even just the Jewish faith, because of course there is, there's not really one, there's so many communities. But I do think there is this element of religiosity and what it brings. I really like what Zainab said, it is a way of life for many people. It's not a side note or something you do on the weekend. It is for some, at least, a thread that runs in and out of their every day, and some of the practices and rituals which bring people a huge amount of meaning and identity and possibly comfort. And kind of, we all missed our routine and our structure in the pandemic, and for many, religion is that. And some of them you can do at home. But for some of them, when we pray in Judaism, many of us pray with a quorum. We call it a minyan. It's 10 men, and we couldn't do that. Our religious festivals, just like any other faith community, are very much exactly about community and being together. And whether that's going to synagogue or temple or to your mosque or your church or any other religious space, doing it at home or praying by yourself is very, very different. Just from my own experience, yesterday was Yom Kippur, which is our high holy day. It's the day where God seals us for the book of life. So you really want to be praying. And I have a daughter, I had her in the pandemic, so I spent most of my time at home with her. And I've found the response to, finding that quite difficult, wonderful from my own perspective and my own community, of being reassured by faith leaders that is the point of my day, is to be with my daughter, not to be worrying about prayer and things like that. And that's what God wants me to do, which is hugely comforting, kind of thinking about the role of women in religion, which people come to in very many different ways. But I did, when I could pray at home, I found it hard, versus when I would maybe be in synagogue with a community and there's this beautiful singing going on and this real feeling of like, you're all in this together. And that was missed for pretty much everyone who felt that way in the pandemic, And then there was just coming together on festivals with your families, with your friends, regardless of how excellent that mental health impact can be, if you are included. And of course, some people do feel excluded because of their mental illness and faith communities, which is something 100% needs to be more addressed. But I think very much that community feel, whether it's prayer, whether it's how you celebrate your festivals, the rhythm of your day, if you are going to prayer a few times a day or going to learning spaces or taking part in your community. I think that was really missed in the pandemic.
For sure. Thank you, Emma. Zainab, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, actually, I think Emma covered most bases. Yeah, I agree with that a lot, especially because Islam has there's a lot of rituals and routines. Like we pray 5 times a day, we go to the mosque every Friday for Jummah, and then there's Ramadan, which was heavily impacted by COVID. Usually Ramadan is spent with families. You open your fast around a big community or your family, and that was very hard to do. And I think for people who are also new to Islam, where the mosque might be their safe space, and that's where they get their sense of community, and I think that would have definitely impacted them. And I can't speak for them, but it's definitely had an impact on well-being and mental health, because religion is such a source of good well-being and mental health, that having that stopped and having to find then new rituals and routines to rely on, when you might not even have maybe a supportive family or a family, and you might be living alone. I can't even imagine how lonely that is, and I'm privileged enough to not be in that position, but I imagine that would have been very, very difficult. And with our work, I think we've had to then shift things. We had to shift some events online, which doesn't have the same impact when you can have the discussions face to face and people get that face to face interaction. So yeah, but that's sort of on the minor level of the impact, because we can adjust and we can still reach out to people, but it just had to change. We just had to change our approach in reaching people and getting the word out there and making sure that they can still ask for help and what help there is that they can get digitally. It just meant that we had to get a little bit more savvy as well. That's it. Yeah.
Yes, I think that thing of us all having to kind of work harder to find the people who need the support and to let them know the support is still there in different form. Louisa, did you want to come in on that? I think you did.
I did, just because I wanted to share what one of our youth board members actually said to me, and I was remembering it whilst you were talking. So one of our youth board members is Muslim, and I remember her telling me the impact that the vaccine conversation was having on her mental health, because typically there was a few things that she shared in her experience that I'll just share secondhand, of course, but I think it's important for the conversation. So the one was that there were actually a lot of members of her community that were still praying together, and she found that she felt that she took that on as an anxiety. She bore that as an anxiety because I guess she is from a different generation. She was, choosing to proceed through this COVID journey in a different way to them. And she was taking it into school. And so she felt very responsible for the actions of her elders. But then there was the flip side of that also, which was in the vaccine conversation, which was a lot of elders within her community didn't want to have the vaccine. There was a real kind of reluctance around it. I can see Zainab nodding, and I'm not sure if you experienced this similar, but she was telling me that actually, as a young girl, as a young Muslim woman, going through COVID at a time when they were in lockdown and then just back out of lockdown and back into school and whatever, she really felt this burden from, this mental burden from really kind of torn between her community and her elders to what she was experiencing when she was going back into school. So that was just a useful piece of information, I think, that was maybe hopefully worth sharing.
Thank you so much, Louisa. Yeah, I think that sort of struggle that so many of us faced in the pandemic of trying to work out what the right thing is to do when different people around you feel differently. And when that kind of comes into your faith and your community, it becomes much more complicated and loaded. I was just going to pass over to you, Priya, for another question. Do you think in the work that Papyrus does it ever come up for you that these social expectations of women and girls, or these young women, do you think that has a real impact for them on their mental health?
Absolutely. You mentioned there, Louise, it's really interesting when you were talking there about that sort of testimony from that person on the board. It's that tension. There's that tension between all our different facets. I don't know if this is the same for young men. I don't have that experience in my body, so I don't know. But I know as a woman, having been a girl and a woman, there are so many facets to us. We have different faces, masks on all the time, kind of echoes that kind of pandemic issue. We are always something, a friend, a mother, a sister, a daughter, working, and there's always this tension between what we think we should be doing, what we are doing, what other people want us to do, expectations, and now that's obviously gone into social media, as you were saying, Louise, about that expectation of what a good person is and what a good life is, and it's become very sort of material and objective. So I think a lot of that does come through on calls to our helpline. So we run a helpline called Helpline UK. That's where bulk of our support for young people who are thinking about suicide comes, so directly supporting those young people, and they talk about pressures. So we run verbal interventions on the phone with those young people who are thinking about suicide. Doesn't matter what point they are in terms of thinking about suicide, we will run those interventions with everybody, and we find out what is it, and we allow them that space to talk. And we do collate anonymously themes that come up weekly, monthly, annually. Social media, social pressures, social anxiety, expectations of what they should be, what they should look like, who they should be, what they should have materially, projections that other people have about what they should be, feature so heavily when it comes to girls and young women. And it's just too much pressure from society as a whole. What we should be and what we are inside, there's that tension. And that tension, unfortunately, is what causes a lot of people to struggle with their mental health.
Thank you, Priya. It's so clear when you put it like that, how all of these things start to add up for young women. Emma and Zainab, I'd like to end by asking you a question. What would you say to people working in secular mental health spaces about the need to understand faith and faith communities?
It's a good question, because I work with Hey Peterborough, and I'm one of their specialists, and my job is to engage with the Muslim community, and I get paid for that, which is great, because I've been in a job before where actually I did that for free. And then that onus is on people of color then, or people from marginalized communities, to then do that work. And actually that's exhausting, and it's exhausting already trying to exist within this society, and then to then have the onus on you to change things. That's just exhausting. And I think what secular mental health spaces can do is uplift those voices that are already banging on about it, rightfully so, and listen, like actually listen, and take action, but to uplift those voices. And what I see happening is secular spaces trying to do it their way, what they think that actually what we want. And I see that a lot, and I get really annoyed, because there's already people doing that and they're not being uplifted, or they're not actually, like, they have no idea that these people even exist and are doing the work. And that's annoying. And so I think it's actually going out there and visiting these communities. And we all look very different. Not every Muslim looks like me, for example. And they're going to be very different needs. And creating this, I think, creating something where you've actually gone and spoken to different people from the community that you're looking to work with. That's the most important thing. I think being active, like listening is one thing, but then actually going and visiting these people and seeing what they do and what they like and what they need is the most important, because I see people doing surveys all the time. And then like questionnaires about what GPs can do, or things like this, and no action from it whatsoever. And I think that's where the trust just deteriorates. It's building that trust and building that bridge, and it's not, the onus isn't on us to build that bridge, it's very much on the other way. So you making that effort and doing that work.
I would just 100% agree. I think there's this theme that all of us have spoken about, whether it's as a young woman of faith, or any minority, is that you don't know what it's like to be me. And when we have that feeling and we hold it, it makes everything about our lives a little bit scarier. And that's true of seeking support for your mental health. Will they understand what it's like to be me, or am I going to have to sit there and explain everything? And we know that when our mental health isn't great, it's already exhausting, and it takes a lot to actually go and seek that support, and then to fear that someone will either actively discriminate or just, as Zainab was saying, put the onus on you to explain and advocate for yourself and educate. And, you know, when you get support, that it should be about you and helping you. It shouldn't be your healthcare provider's opportunity to know what it's like to be a Jewish woman, a Muslim woman, a Hindu woman, a Christian woman. And as I think Zainab said in an earlier question, there is also so many stereotypes within religious communities. And of course, there's the diversity I alluded to, but what it is like to be a religious woman from various communities. And I think you mentioned things like oppression, or that we're deeply unhappy with our role, and things like that. And so, like you're saying, accountability, we need to see that services are taking those steps to understand what faith communities and different faith communities are like, and trying to, you know, build a language and an understanding, so that when you go in the room and you sit there, you don't have to start explaining who you are and why your religion is important. And, you know, that's really important for that empathy and that understanding, which really fuels the connection that happens in a mental health service, and is really vital. Because of course, if you don't feel that you can trust the person, or that they're taking the steps to understand, if you feel like you're a tick boxing exercise, then you're not going to get the support that you need at the end of the day. And of course, we have to balance that with, this is an ongoing journey, right, that we're all on to understand each other's lives narrative. And so, you know, you can go into one community from one faith community and get one version of events. But if you had, you know, a few hundred women who were religious in various different communities and various different faiths, you'd have 500 narratives as well. So having that balance between not being the expert on faith, but trying to be open-minded, understand, bit of a balance, a hard one, admittedly.
Thank you so much, Emma. I think if there's a lot of calls to action in this conversation, I think, which is really motivating and inspiring. But if this panel of women is anything to go by, there's definitely a lot of women out there who are here to support and here to create space for women and girls accessing help for their mental health. So I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you so much to all our speakers for their input in this discussion today, and helping us demystify and hopefully destigmatize this conversation about mental health and well-being of women and girls. I hope we can continue to connect up the dots, as we've done today, with practitioners working both in secular mental health spaces and those targeting support to faith communities. We'll be linking to everyone's websites in the bio of this video, so please do support the organisations we've heard from today and access more information or support if you need it. And I know my colleagues on the call today will echo this, but remember, if you're struggling, you are absolutely not alone. Thank you.